another episode. This is episode 77 of the Coffee at 11 show, brought to you by wigwam.ie SME Peer Support. Delighted to have you join us here in the cafe. Delighted in particular to have my guest, gentleman that I've been introduced to recently, who's living in Vienna, zooming in all the way from Vienna this morning. And it is indeed Barry McLoughlin. Barry, it's lovely to have you in the cafe. Please come in and say hello or show us a coffee mug or a glass of water, whatever you have.
Hello, everybody.
Great to see you, Barry. Great to see you. Let me just tell you a little bit about Barry, just to set the scene. But I'm really intrigued by this gentleman's journey, and I'm looking forward to having the chat. So Barry was born in Limerick back in 1949. He went to the Crescent College Comprehensive, known as the Comp. My daughter's just finished there this year in 2020, but Barry finished there in 1967. Went on to work for Allied Irish Banks, when it was Allied Irish Banks back in the day, for 5 years before enrolling in UCD, University College Dublin, in 1972 to study German and history. Teacher training in 1977, and that led him to a move to Vienna, landing on the 15th of October, a very specific date, 1979, with the intention to study for a Ph.D. in contemporary history. And reading into Barry's story, I'm fascinated by his fascination for what appears to be Irish involvement in conflict at a global level, with works covering the Irish fighting, the Spanish, fighting for Republican Spain, 1936 to 38. I think that's your most recent book, if I'm not mistaken. And Left to the Wolves, Irish Victims of Stalinist Terror. Really excited with that. And I see Emmett O'Connor has joined us. Emmett, you're very welcome, because I understand you two gentlemen are going to release a tome later in the year, and we get to that towards the end of the show. So Barry, you're very welcome. Please, would you take us back to those early years in Limerick, if you wouldn't mind? Thank you.
I grew up in Lower Lord Edward Street. My mother was a postmistress, and my father worked for the corporation. He was a rent collector. And we moved up to Rossbrine in 1959. My grandfather was alone, and we moved in with him. And then the lease in the house expired, and we moved out to Iona Drive of the North Circular Road. And then we moved back in to David Street, 1962, with the pub, the Haven, and Davis Street. So yeah, that was, we did a bit of traveling around Limerick, but it was a conventional kind of happy childhood. By the way, Crescent College was not a comprehensive when I was there. It was a thrashing academy. Corporal punishment, very rigorous Jesuit, sort of old style Jesuit school, but you got a good education if you wanted it. There's plenty in my class. They were only in rugby, but if you're interested in literature or languages or science, they sort of encouraged you.
And thank you for that clarification. I had forgotten, of course, that it wasn't a comp, couldn't have been a comp back in the day. Really interesting, a thrashing environment. You clearly had an interest in language and study, it would appear. And where did that come from, do you know, Barry?
Well, I suppose I was fortunate because there was no television when I started to read in the 50s. So I read an awful lot, and there was lots of books in the house, and you were encouraged to read. There was a school library. I remember reading George Orwell, when I was 16, Homage to Catalonia. I just had a liking for languages. And I was, yeah. Well, but I was a very normal little boy. I was fighting, playing soccer in the street. I wasn't a good rugby player. I was too small. But it was happy enough.
Yeah,
childhood.
it seems that way. It seems that way. And just before the show, you were saying you were dying to get in and talk about sporting Limerick back in the 50s. So give us a bit of a snapshot, will you please?
Well, of course, rugby in those days was amateur, and you'd cycle up to Tuman Park on a Saturday, and there'd be the senior Munster Rugby League or the Cup, great matches, Bohemians get against Shannon, and I remember old Crescent playing, Billy Leahy out half, Mick English playing for Bowes and Bill Mulcahy, and then you go up to the Market Street. And they were fairly good in the late 50s, Limerick, Donny Wallace, who's a Cork man, still alive, I believe. Togsy Lynham, Dwyer, the goalie. Yeah, it was great crack. The remarks from the old guys with the caps, keep you in stitches. So, yeah, they were innocent. We were very innocent.
But, lovely. It's really interesting to look back on old photographs, and as I think Simon and Garfunkel sang in one of their songs, "Everything looks better in black and white," and it's sort of true. It has this, we can imagine life being in black and white back in the day. You mentioned laners, and you mentioned vandalism against property.
Well, I meant state vandalism in demolishing Lower Edward Street in 1960. Whereas I had a happy childhood, you were always aware of poverty in Limerick. It was widespread poverty, and if you were downtown, let's say 1958, which was the high point of Irish emigration, you see the young ones and young fellas walking up to the station to take the Rosslare train, and when I was leaving Limerick in 1967, I remember walking around with my pal Fonzie, and there were parts of the city that were just falling down. Arthur's Quay now, it's a new quarter. But it's just fallen down, fallen into the river. So I was always conscious and politically conscious, because we used to talk politics at home and history, and my grandfather or my father. So I grew up with this knowledge of history, interest in history, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the term state vandalism, and it's where basically the state came in and bulldozed your former home, if I'm not mistaken, and the row of buildings that were attached. So you were shifted.
There they are.
Oh, go on, lift it up a little bit. Perfect.
I can see the post office and Canine shop. Yeah, that was it.
Barry, thank you for that. So listen, we're talking Limerick in the 50s, black and white background. You mentioned that poignant image, or you gave us that poignant image of girls and boys walking up towards the station, Culver Station, to get the Rosslare train, and then you found yourself heading that direction yourself in the 60s. Tell us about the move away from Limerick first time. Did you go to Dublin first before heading international?
No, I got a clerkship, as it's called, in the Munster Leinster Bank, which was hard enough thing to get in those days. And I was stationed in Dungarvan, which was interesting for me because my paternal grandparents were from the general area, Shanfubble in West Waterford. So they were native speakers. But I didn't. They died before I was born. So I was interested in that side of my family as well, and they were very humorous people. Cork, East Cork, working class, very funny, and very welcoming, and a great sense of history and belonging. So that was important. And then I was stationed to Dublin and 1969, and the bank strike was the makings of me. No, none of you here remember the 1970 bank strike. I mean, the country functioned completely, in order. The banks were closed. You could go into Woolworths and buy a Munster Leinster's checkbook, but you had to put a penny stamp on it. So when the strike ended, May to November, we made so much money on overtime. I said, the hell with this, for a game of soldiers, and go to university, because I always wanted to go to university, and I was mature enough to go at 23. I don't think I was mature enough at 18,
I think that's very interesting, by the way, that you took those handful of years out, 4 or 5 years out before going to college. I do think, at a personal level, I think it's a mistake for people to go straight from school into third level and then come out, because they sort of come out the far end thinking they know it all, and sure, it's only beginning then. So I think
that's right. Yeah.
Those years would stand to you. By the way, the bank, a later bank strike was the makings of Christy Moore, from memory.
No, it was an earlier one.
Was an earlier
the
one?
66 bank strike. And actually it was, the momentum behind the strike was by the juniors, the young girls and boys working in the bank, because the money was rubbish. It really was. It was full of snobbery. You had no money, but you were supposed to play golf. I never played golf.
You and me both never played around in my life.
No, ruined a good walk.
Yeah, good walk. There you go. It's look, it's great stuff. I'm really curious though about your interest in language and history, and so you went off to Vienna in '79 on a scholarship of some sort.
Yeah, there was a exchange scholarship. And
what happened thereafter?
Well, I got it for 1.5 years, and I studied and research. In those days, photocopies were very dear, so you make a lot of handwritten notes. And I was an English teacher. I was a waiter. I did all these nixes, and then with my wife, we had a daughter, Siobhan, 1984. I somehow managed to survive and got my doctorate. And then I was very lucky because 1990 was when the archives in Russia began to open up, and I went there a lot, So.
And this is where it gets really curious for people like myself, and I'm quite sure a number of other people in the cafe here today, as to what that was like, with Russia opening up. It must have been very heady days. Were they dangerous days? Were you nervous?
Well, you want to be careful in the street, if people talk to you, not to answer back. Foreigners were murdered, several cases, but generally it was okay. But there's absolute chaos, economic chaos in Russia. 1991, no restaurants, queues in the bread shops. It was very tough time for Russians, and that's why the older people vote for Putin, because he's brought some kind of a stability. But they were very, very liberal in the archives, ultra-liberal. But that stopped in 1990, 95. Then there was a rollback. So, but it wasn't too bad up to about 2002. It wasn't too bad. But now it's quite difficult. I don't go there anymore.
Okay, but in that time where it was quite liberal, you obviously, it whetted your appetite for some of the for some of the stories that you stumbled across. And can you bring us to that book, Left to the Wolves, Irish Victims of Stalinist Terror? How did that come about for you?
Well, I was sitting in my flat in Vienna and was reading the Moscow News, which was a kind of a pro-Gorbachev English language newspaper. And there was an article about former journalists of the Daily News who had disappeared in the 1930s. And there was a name, Pádraig Breslin. So I knew he was Irish. But it took me a long time to find his family. And then I found out he had two families. he had a Russian family and an Irish family. And I had my first one. And the second one was, I knew that from literature. He was from Donegal. He was a radio operator for the Russian espionage in Spain, Brian Gould Forshaw. And the third guy, actually I got this wrong in the book. McAteer was his name. He was a friend of Sean Liam O'Flaherty's. And he fled to Russia because he killed a man in a bank raid. No, post office raid. In 1923 in Liverpool. He said it was for the cause, but we don't know. Anyway, he got out and a man was sentenced to death by hanging his accomplice, Jim Phelan, who was a very famous writer at the time, but he wasn't hanged. He got 18 years. But McAteer was in Odessa, and he's a translator. And he told the police who arrested him, and they only arrested him because he was a foreigner, he told them this cock and bull story that he was from Forkhill. No, not Forkhill. He was from the border area, and he'd gone to school in Dundalk. It turned out, when the book came out, his relatives rang up the Pat Kenny show and they said he was a Scouser. He was from Liverpool. So, yeah, so they were the three characters.
And characters for sure with backstories themselves.
Yeah.
Quite incredible. It's really interesting to hear the fact that you took three individual stories, and if you like, you described the Stalinist terror regime around those three stories. So that must have been fascinating. Again, I have to ask the question, you know, each of the three of them were picked up for various different reasons. One of them you mentioned was actually working for the Russians in Spain, and yet he became a victim of Russia. How does that work? What went wrong there?
Well, Brian Gould Forshaw was an idealist, and he'd sympathy with anti-Stalinist forces in the Spanish Republic, and he disobeyed orders earlier by bringing his girlfriend to Moscow. he was trained there as a radio operator, and he brought this German girl who was a political refugee in London, whom I got to know afterwards, by the way. So he was a marked man, and I knew about him because people who survived talked about him, because he was a sort of a very well-spoken sort of home rule aristocrat family, and they mentioned him, you know, being in a cell with him. So then I found out his nephew, David Sims, who sadly died last year. He was the professor of mathematics mathematics in Trinity. So you had to have a letter from the family before you got all these files. So yeah, that's the way it worked out.
No, well done, well done. So it's great stuff, and of course that ties nicely into the Spain years and that piece that you wrote, fighting for Republican Spain, 1936 to 38. Will you tell us about that? That's, if I'm not mistaken, that's your most recent book. We're coming up to the one with Emmett very soon.
Well, that's just about, well, it's mainly about the Limerick lads, 6 of them from Limerick. I've also done a video on these Limerick, so Limerick men in the international brigades. It's on YouTube. It's on my home page. So I then said to Emmett, okay, I've that done now. We better think about writing the definitive study, because the files of the International Brigade were available, and they're even online now. So then we said, well, Emmett, you'll have to go to England to the National Archives. They're not called the National Archives of the United Kingdom, by the way. They're called the National Archive, as if there was no other nation in the world. But that's typical anyway. And I went to, I went to Spain to research, and I went to Berlin. So we finished that about 2 years ago, and then we wrote the book. And it's coming out.
It's great stuff. But what is it? What is it about the Irish psyche, or certain elements of the Irish psyche, that we, leave the homeland, if you like, and take up arms in a struggle? It's got nothing to do with us. What's going on there?
Well, Emmett is very good on this. He maintains that Ireland was not a kind of Celtic, not only a priest-ridden, it wasn't a priest-ridden backwater. It was priest-ridden, all right, but it was very globalized. And all Irish revolutionary organizations have taken in an interest in foreign affairs. Like Irish Republicans were very interested in the Indian independence movement, and they came to Dublin in the 30s, and they were feted by De Valera. And by 1936, if you were a left winger, you said to yourself, well, if we don't stop it in Spain, we couldn't stop it in Italy or Germany or Austria, fascism. We don't stop it in Spain, it'll spread to France, and who knows that then what'll happen. So they volunteered about 250 plus Irish volunteered to fight for the Spanish Republic, for the government, against the mutinous generals who were bankrolled and equipped by Mussolini and Hitler, whereas the Republicans in Spain, they got some help from Russia, but it was very difficult to keep up a flow of arms because Russia was so far away.
And who is this guy, Frank Ryan?
Well, you should go out to his village in County Limerick. Hang on a second. I always mix up the village. Elton. And there's 2 monuments to him in the village, and the local historical society, the Knockany Historical Society. I'm very interested in Frank Ryan. He was an Irish language enthusiast, a graduate, an IRA man, and then he went more and more to the left. And he said the main reason he went to Spain, and he was a very popular figure in Ireland, was that O'Duffy had led about 700 Irishmen to fight for Franco, and he said, we don't want the good name of Ireland disgraced fighting for fascism. So he led a group from Dublin, the first groups. But other people, Irish people arrived in Spain from all over the world, from Canada, America, Australia, Britain. Most of them went from Britain. So there was about 250 of them over the 2 years, almost 2 years of service. And yeah, they fought very high losses. They were generally underarmed, outnumbered, but a very interesting story, but quite a tragic story, brutal, warfare is brutal.
And the pay wasn't great. Of course, there was no pension, and if they got shot or injured or killed, indeed, families got nothing. Is that right?
Hey, that's right.
Come here, Katrina O'Brien is here. Katrina's our editor-in-chief, and she hails from Elton. Would you mind if I bring her in just to say a quick hello? Katrina, come on in.
Okay.
We've spoken before, Barry, a couple of years ago, and I didn't know any of this connection until you told me about it. And a few days later, I was home and I walked down. I think the plaque is down in Bottomstown, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
Plaque, yeah. And I had no idea until you told me all about it.
And where did I meet you?
Here in O'Mahony's, I believe. It might have been a conversation over email.
Oh, yeah,
I was in person. Yeah.
That's right, because you were very kind to me. I signed the book in O'Mahony's.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
It's all coming back now. It was a few years back, I think, wasn't it?
6 years ago.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks, Katrina. I just wanted to make that connection. When you mentioned Elton, Katrina's eyes lit up and I was going, oh my goodness, there's something here. I wonder, would Emmett O'Connor like to pop in and say a quick hello? Emmett, what do you think? Is that a yes? Emmett, you're very welcome. So tell us about the collaboration.
I first met Barry in Linz, in Upper Austria. There was a conference, it used to be, I think it's still going, an annual conference of labour historians. And I was there for the first time, I think 1985. And I remember walking along the road and this guy comes up to me and he says, well, where are you from? In German. And I was struggling for an answer. And then he realized, I realized that he was Irish, and we made a connection. But we've been kind of interested both in Spain and in the Irish involvement in Spain off and on since then. And then we started talking about writing a book, and various other things intervened, and eventually we kind of put everything together, and we've now written this book, which is going to be called In Spanish Trenches: The Mind and Deeds of the Irish in the International Brigades, and hopefully we get it published by the end of this year with UCD Press.
That's fantastic. We'll give you the bull of bus around the cafe and wish you every success. And by all accounts, Barry was telling me it's quite a tome. It's not 100 pages. Yeah,
Barry, I think he wanted it to be the sort of definitive account, and he'd done quite a lot of research in the Russian archives, and felt he wanted to bring in that new dimension. And look at what the Irish actually did in Spain, because I mean there have been some books written on the impact of the Spanish Civil War in Ireland, but people haven't looked at what the Irish actually did in the war, and what conditions were like and how they responded to those conditions and so on, you know. So this is going into great detail on what it's actually like to be in the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, what kind of food they ate, you know, how the command structure operated, what kind of weapons they had, what sort of billets they had, you know, how they survived what were very often very difficult conditions.
It sounds like a fascinating read, and as Barry himself said, it's set up to be the definitive tome, if you like, the definitive guide to what went on back in those days. Emmett, lovely to meet you. Thank you very much for taking the time for coming in, and we wish you every success with the book. Thank you for that. Barry, really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff. Because you know we're an island nation, and to think that we've had that influence around the world in various different parts is just fantastic. You know, back in the day, we were known as the land of saints and scholars, and of course, the priests went off and the missionaries went off and spread the word. And but you know, you referred to the historical Ireland as perhaps being priest-ridden back in the day. You know, and of course, we've lost our way and all the stuff that goes with that. But apart from that, you know, there seems to have been this social conscience bubbling under the surface that led a lot of people away from kith and kin to fight somebody else's battle, really, but probably a battle for mankind. So great stuff. Christina O'Shaughnessy, would you mind coming in and saying a quick hello, if you wouldn't mind?
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Colm. Yeah, when I have a few things to ask Barry, but first of all, I'd like to say that I'm an editor. That's what I do, and I said to Barry that I'd like to edit his book if he wanted me to do so, and he was happy to let me at it. And it was, in fact, very, very difficult to edit, unusually difficult to edit. Why? Because I got so caught up in the text, in reading these accounts of people on battlefields, people being shot, their legs being amputated, you know, people starving and rat-infested cells. It was so fascinating. I think, Jesus, you know, I'm on page 60 and I haven't edited a thing since page 20. So back I had to go. That's why it took so long, Barry, you know. It took a long time to...
Okay, Christina.
You're very detached. And I wasn't detached. Yeah. An excellent read. Excellent. Well done, Barry and Emmett. Just too good, really.
Thank you.
Not at all.
Christina, thank you for that. Thank you for that. So, Barry, listen, it's a pleasure having you come in to the cafe, because you've given us a completely different perspective on life in every sense. You know, we dare I say it, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I live in a bubble and just don't get exposed to this type of stuff. So to have a Limerick man who's traveled the world, who's gone into the KGB archives, and that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And then you've extracted elements of that and you've laid them down there, and they're there for all time. There for posterity. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. Before we go to Q&A, I'd like to go to Q&A, if I may, from the floor, or comment from the floor. Barry, what is it that you are taking with you post-COVID, if anything?
Doing gymnastics at home. So you could have a triple motto. Do it. Focus and be grateful. I think that's a good what's the word, leitmotif, if you like, for your life, but especially when you get to my age. But certainly do it. If you want to do something, do it. Don't put things off. Don't put things off. Do it. Do it. Go for it.
Very nice. Barry, thank you for that. Lovely, lovely stuff. Leitmotif, like that. Okay, folks, who would like to come in and ask a question? Christina, did you say you have a question to ask?
I just wanted to add, when you were talking about the Irish involvement in global affairs, I worked for the United Nations myself for over 20 years, and the Irish contingent is enormous in the United Nations, and most particularly in the peacekeeping side of things. You find Irish everywhere in the peacekeeping. So it's interesting, you know, such a small country, and we're everywhere. People know us, and we're actually quite popular, aren't we? We're liked. We're kind of a harmless, fun-loving nationality. We're appreciated. But you find it, yeah, that's what I thought I'd mention, the presence of the United Nations. Mm. Yeah.
Good stuff. Christina, thank you for that. Thank you. And I have heard it said that we're liked because we've never invaded anybody.
Right. Maybe.
Uh,
Yeah.
it's all good. All good. We're happy being who we are. Is that fair to say? We're happy being who we are. Life is good. All right, Christina, lovely to see you, and thanks indeed for joining us this morning. Okay, Princess Shelley, if you wouldn't mind.
Hey everybody, there's some lovely comments coming into the cafe for you, Barry. There were a little bit later coming in than usual, which I put down to the interesting and captivating story and journey that you brought us all on, and I see lots of nodding heads, so we've loved following you on that, and we were all with you. Sarah Ward, who's in the cafe every day for all of the shows so far, 78 I think we said this morning, wasn't it? Her 78th visit to our cafe, and Sarah said that Left to the Wolves sounds very interesting and we'll definitely give it a read. She sounds like really interesting stuff. She'll definitely give it a read when she can. And Katrina, who we've actually heard from, she's the big boss. She says she remembers, it was just before we went to Elton, she said that there was a connection in fighting for Republic in Spain. So that was great that we heard from Katrina on that. Eamon has popped in the links, Barry, to your published works and to articles, and so your website. So everybody, as I always say, you can highlight that, follow the link a little bit later on, become even more familiar with the great stuff that Barry has shared with us today. Dee Kyo, who it's lovely to have you in the cafe. Dee, you've been here every day the last few weeks. Thank you for joining us. Dee says that she loves Barry's use of language, a thrashing academy, and you were always of poverty companies so much. So yeah, thank you for that comment, Dee. And there's a lot of gratitude, Barry, for your statement that you just said. As soon as the comment section lit up, as soon as you said, do it, focus and be grateful. And you know, each guest every day is asked what do they take from COVID, and I haven't seen the comments light up so quickly. Everybody could kind of relate to it. Do it, focus, grateful. Lisa liked that, liked it. Yeah, Sarah Ward then said the Irish have huge hearts, and that's it. That's what we were saying about the lovable bunch we are here in Ireland, that we do have huge hearts. And then finally, James says that they say the English never remember history, but the Irish people never forget. So, so thank you so much, everyone, for all those lovely comments. It's always great to hear the vibe and what people are chatting about as we listen in on your really great conversation. Certainly joining the ranks of people worth meeting, Barry. I'm sure you'll agree, and thank you very much. I'll pass you over back to the host himself, Colm, the host with the most.
Thanks, Shell. That's great. Thank you for that. That was lovely piece. Yeah, genuinely one of my favorite parts of the show for several reasons. Apart from the you know, the lightness and air and beauty with which you conduct it, Princess Shelley. Yes, indeed, the regalness with which you approach it. It's just that I get to listen to what's being done on the cafe, and it is that people are listening to the conversation, Barry, and then they're inputting stuff that they think of as it comes through. And that comment there from James originally. James with us for the last period of time, and James is one of the English men who joins us in the cafe regularly, and it's true. We had a very interesting conversation some weeks back with a gentleman, Donald Thurlow, and he was in Ireland one week and in the UK the following week, and he finished his Irish lessons with Cromwell, story of Cromwell, and the following week he went over, and sure, over here Cromwell was a bad man, let's say, and over there Cromwell was a hero. And it's just quite fascinating how propaganda works. Interesting stuff. Listen, Barry, it's been a pleasure having you in the cafe today, and I hope you've enjoyed your little visit to our little cafe. Hope it's been good for you.
Yeah, it was great. It was great, and I'm looking forward to Limerick, visiting Katrina, and going into the pub in Knockany and having a few pints. and where the old guys will be singing south of the border down Mexico way. Sing song.
I love it. You sound like if we nudged you, there might be a bar given. Would you give us another bar?
Well, I'll talk to my investors.
All right, good stuff, good stuff. Listen, Barry, lovely indeed that you came to visit us today. Thank you. Just stay where you are just for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. Folks, lovely to have you all here in the cafe today. Thank you indeed. Particular congratulations to Kathy Mera, who became a grandmother overnight for the first time. We're delighted for you. Delighted that all is well there. Great news, great news. And let me just tell you about what's happening in the cafe tomorrow. We have a lady in from the north of Ireland, Noelle McLoughlin is her name, and she is an artist, but an activist artist, and I'm really curious to hear what that's all about. It's about her belief and her passion that arts can influence communities and can support regeneration, can support peace and reconciliation. So I'm really excited about that. So if you have time tomorrow, perhaps make the time tomorrow to come in and meet my special guest, Noelle McLoughlin. Want to thank, as ever, Princess Shelley for producing today's show. Big heart emoji. Thanks for that. The monk, Eamon Smith, for keeping us safe and secure in that lovely mindful moment at the start. The lovely Katrina O'Brien, who's joined us in full today. Lovely to have you here, Katrina, and that you got involved today. Lovely that there was the Elton connection made today. And of course, Katrina will make this beautiful later on, top and tail it for dissemination to our international audience later. Thank you for that. And want to thank wigwam.ie SME peer support for their ongoing support. And I just finished the show, as I always do, by saying, Barry McLoughlin, it's been a pleasure. Namaste, my friend. Namaste.
Namaste.
And that's it. It's been lovely having you here, Barry. Stay where you are for just a minute, if that's okay. We just unmute everybody. They can say their hellos and goodbyes as they're getting ready to leave. Folks, please say your hellos and goodbyes. Thank you.
Don't forget, everyone, to pop the 25th of July as well into the diary. Isn't that right, Colm?
Oh, thank you indeed. Yeah.
Fully med for a party.
Yeah.
This is a live show. Yes, forgive me. I did mention a handful of dates for your diary. Wednesday the 15th, next Wednesday, tomorrow week, we've got the lovely Katrina O'Brien in the hot seat. Looking forward to that because Katrina is definitely a person worth meeting. Thursday the 16th is a bit dodgy. It's me in the hot seat.
I'm a dodgy.
But I've been asked to do it, so I'm going to get it out of the way that day. And then we have a very special guest on the final day. But the 25th, Saturday the 25th, we are having a live event. It's not a show per se. It's just so anybody who's been part of the show can come along. The Old Barracks Coffee Roastery in Bird Hill, County Tipperary, exit 27 off the M7. And look forward to seeing you all there, as many of you as can, for about 11 o'clock. Thank you for that, Princess Shelley. Thanks for the reminder. Right, folks, say hellos and goodbyes to my special guest. Barry, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks a million,
Thank you.
Barry. It was lovely.